There are secrets people take to their graves. I'm no exception. I intended to remain silent forever. Until my last breath. But after thousands of sleepless nights, facing myself in the darkness, I realized that silence is sometimes more terrifying than guilt. I decided to tell this story, not to beg for forgiveness, but perhaps just to lighten my heart a little before it's too late. What would you do if the only person who truly made you feel alive was someone you absolutely mustn't touch? This isn't just a story about lust. This is a life or death battle between morality and instinct for a woman who has lived almost her entire life. Don't judge me until you hear everything that happened behind the slightly ajar door of that house. Part 1. Silent Echoes Under One Roof. The autumn sky over the city was often draped in a heavy cloak of gray. As somber as Clara's mood, at 58, most people would be finding peace in their golden years, perhaps tending to a garden or enjoying the company of grandchildren. But Clara's life had become a series of ironic twists orchestrated by fate. After the passing of her husband Richard's first wife, Clara had entered this grand, silent house as a stepmother later in life. Richard was a kind man, but dry and distant. A man of 70 who was more preoccupied with his antique collections and long trips to visit old friends than with the emotional landscape of his own home. Within these walls, the arrival of Julian, Richard's son from his first marriage, became the source of an underground storm that no one could have predicted. Julian was 40 years old. He was a man of quiet intensity, with deep-set eyes that always seemed to harbor an unsaid melancholy. Following a series of setbacks in both his career and his personal life, Julian had moved back into the family estate to live with his father and Clara. Initially, the relationship between the stepmother and stepson was strictly formal, polite greetings, occasional small talk, and silent dinners under the dim glow of the dining room chandelier. Clara took her role seriously, meticulously caring for the house and the comfort of the two men. However, the forced intimacy of the shared space, the accidental brush of hands while passing a plate, or the lingering gazes in the dimly lit hallway during restless nights began to spark something dangerous. Clara was a woman of traditional values. Her dignity and moral compass were the foundations of her identity. She understood her position perfectly. She was acutely aware of the 18-year age gap and the sacred boundary of the title she held. Yet, the heart rarely obeys the commands of logic. Julian was nothing like his father. He was observant, attuned to the slightest shift in Clara's expression. On afternoons when Richard was away, leaving the house unnervingly quiet, Julian would wordlessly help her in the kitchen. The silence between them wasn't awkward, instead, it was thick with the unspoken language of mutual understanding. Julian often looked at her with a gaze that was a volatile mix of longing and reverence, a combination that left Clara tossing and turning for hours in the dark. She blamed herself. She felt a deep sense of revulsion for the fleeting thoughts that crossed her mind. Whenever her heart skipped a beat at one of Julian's small acts of kindness, she would retreat into her books or lose herself in housework to scrub away his image. She told herself it was merely the loneliness of a woman neglected by her husband. A simple maternal bond, but the truth was far more predatory. One stormy evening, while Richard was away at a historical society gala in another city, the house was left to just Clara and Julian. The rain drumming on the roof sounded like a frantic pulse, urging on the emotions they had both tried to bury. Clara was struggling to shut the heavy windows on the balcony against the rising wind when a flash of lightning tore across the sky. The sudden, deafening crack of thunder made her lose her footing. In that split second, a pair of strong arms caught her. It was Julian. The distance between their faces was barely an inch. His warm breath grazed her forehead, and his masculine scent, mingled with the ozone of the rain, clouded her senses. Clara's body trembled, her hands intended to push him away, but they lacked the will. Julian didn't let go. Instead, he pulled her closer, whispering words she had never dared to hear. "Clara, why do you keep pretending? Why do you fight this so hard?" The question was a blade through the armor she had spent years building. She managed to push him back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "You're out of your mind. Julian, I am your father's wife. I am, for all intents and purposes, your mother. She spoke with a voice that shook with fear, not fear of him, but fear of her own crumbling resolve. Julian stood there in the shadows, his eyes dark and desperate. I know everything, but I can't lie to myself anymore. The way you look at me, the way you care, you feel it too, don't you? Clara fled to her room and locked the door. She leaned against the wood, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Looking in the mirror, she saw a 58-year-old woman with fine lines around her eyes. And she felt a wave of terror. Guilt surrounded her like a black abyss. She slapped her own cheek, trying to wake herself from the nightmare. No, absolutely not, she whispered into the darkness. Yet, that night was the longest of her life. The sound of Julian's footsteps pacing the hallway, the heavy sighs she could almost feel through the door, kept her paralyzed. Her conviction was beginning to crack, and she knew that this battle against desire would be more grueling than anything she had ever faced. In the days that followed, Clara went to great lengths to avoid him. She left for the market earlier, returned later, and always found a reason to never be in a room alone with him. Richard returned, oblivious as ever to the electricity humming through the air. His indifference was, ironically, the catalyst that pushed Clara toward Julian. Every time Richard ignored her attempts at conversation or fell asleep in his armchair while she yearned for a meaningful connection, she found herself involuntarily comparing him to Julian's warmth and intensity. The tension simmered like embers beneath a pile of dry leaves, waiting for a single breath of wind to ignite. That breath came on a late afternoon while Clara was in the garden. Julian approached her and, without a word, took her calloused hand and pressed a soft kiss to it. This time, she didn't pull away. The crushing weight of her loneliness, the suppressed hunger for affection, and the guilt she had carried for so long finally broke her. In that moment, the laws of society and the labels of family dissolved. There were only two lonely souls reaching out in the dark, clutching at a fragile, forbidden warmth. Part 2: The Labyrinth of Guilt and the Cycle of Falling. The initial fall was not a sudden crash, but a slow, agonizing slide into a world of shadows. For Clara, the days that followed that afternoon in the garden were a blur of heightened senses and paralyzing dread. Every floorboard that creaked under Julian's weight felt like a scream of accusation. Every time she looked at Richard across the breakfast table, she felt as though the word traitor was etched onto her forehead in jagged letters. Yet, despite the crushing weight of her conscience, the forbidden pull of Julian's presence was like a narcotic. For the first time in decades, someone looked at her not as a housekeeper or a companion of convenience, but as a woman who was seen, desired, and understood. Their secret life existed in the margins of the day, in the quiet hours after Richard went to bed, or the fleeting moments when he was out running errands. It was a relationship built on whispers and stolen glances, a desperate attempt to find light in a room where they had deliberately blown out the candles. Julian was relentless in his devotion, filling the emotional void that Richard had left hollow for so long. He would leave small notes for her in the pages of her favorite books. He would brush his hand against hers in the hallway, a touch that felt like a bolt of electricity through her weary soul. But for every moment of pleasure, Clara paid 1,000-fold in shame. "We have to stop, Julian," she would whisper, her voice trembling as they stood in the moonlit kitchen. "This is a sin. We are destroying everything." Julian would only look at her with that intense, sorrowful gaze, taking her hands in his. "Is it a sin to love someone who was dying of thirst? Look at us, Clara. We were both ghosts in this house until we found each other." But Clara knew better. She was a woman of faith, a woman who believed in the sanctity of the vows she had taken. The cognitive dissonance began to take a physical toll on her. She lost weight, the dark circles under her eyes deepened. She started attending church more frequently, sitting in the back pew and weeping silently as the hymns echoed through the rafters. She was begging for a strength she didn't seem to possess. One morning, after a particularly sleepless night, Clara made a vow to herself. She would end it. She would be the mother she was supposed to be, the wife Richard deserved. For 2 weeks, She became a fortress. She stopped responding to Julian's notes. She locked her door every night and treated him with a cold, professional detachment that seemed to wound him more than any words could. She threw herself into her duties with a manic energy, scrubbing the floors until her knuckles bled, cooking elaborate meals for Richard, and trying to reignite a spark in her marriage. She forced herself to sit with Richard in the evenings, listening to his long, rambling stories about the past, trying to convince herself that this was where she belonged. She thought she had won. She felt a sense of grim pride as the days passed without a lapse. But the human heart is a treacherous thing, especially one that has been starved for as long as Clarice. Julian did not push her, he simply waited. He watched her from across the room with a silent, pained understanding that was harder to resist than any persuasion. He looked like a man who was also grieving. A man who had found his soul only to have it snatched away again. The relapse happened on a Tuesday. A day of mundane chores and suffocating heat. Richard had gone to a neighboring town to examine a rare coin collection. The house was a pressure cooker of unsaid words. Clara was in the laundry room, her head light from the heat and the constant strain of her self-imposed exile. Julian entered, his presence immediately filling the small, humid space. He didn't say a word. He simply walked up to her and rested his forehead against hers. "I can't do this anymore. Clara," he choked out. "I see you suffering. I see you trying to kill the best part of yourself because you're afraid of what the world will say. But please, just don't shut me out." The dam broke. All the prayers, all the scrubbing, all the cold distance vanished in a heartbeat. Clara sobbed into his chest, her hands clutching his shirt as if she were drowning. "I'm a terrible woman," she wailed. "I'm so lost." "Julian." "You're not lost," he whispered, pulling her into the shadows behind the drying racks. "You're home." And so, the cycle began again, but this time it was darker, laced with the desperation of people who knew they were on a collision course with disaster. The guilt didn't vanish, it simply became a part of the landscape. Like a mountain they had to climb every day just to see the sun. Clara lived in a state of constant, determined repentance. Every morning she would wake up and promise God this was the last time. Every evening, she found herself drawn back into the orbit of the only person who made her feel alive. She began to develop a sort of double life, a psychological split that allowed her to function. By day, she was the dutiful Mrs. Sterling, the pillar of the household. By night, she was a woman caught in a fever dream, wandering through a labyrinth of her own making. She started to resent Richard, not for anything he had done, but because his very existence was the tether that made her love for Julian a crime. She watched him sleep and felt a sickening mixture of pity and rage. Why couldn't he see? Why was he so blind to the tragedy unfolding under his own roof? The months turned into a year. The secrecy became more difficult to maintain. There were close calls, a door left unlocked, a lingering look caught in a mirror, a neighbor's curious question about why Julian was seen in the garden so late at night. The stress was eroding them both. Julian became more possessive, his love turning into a jagged edge that cut them both. Clara realized that they couldn't go on like this. They were like two people trapped in a sinking ship, breathing the last pockets of air. She knew that if something didn't change, the weight of the secret would eventually pull them both under, and Richard would be the collateral damage of their selfishness. She began to pray again, but this time, her prayer was different. She didn't ask for the strength to stay. She asked for a way out, a door that would lead them away from each other before they destroyed everything they touched. Part 3. The Final Door and the Bittersweet Liberation. As the second year of their clandestine life drew to a close, the air in the Sterling household had grown so heavy it felt as if the very walls were closing in. Clara felt like a ghost haunting her own life. The passion that had once felt like a lifeline had transformed into a cage. She looked at Julian, now 42, and saw a man whose prime years were being wasted in the shadows of his father's house. Tethered to a woman nearly 20 years his senior by a bond of shared sin and stagnant hope. She realized that her love was no longer an act of devotion. But an act of theft, she was stealing his future to soothe her own past. The turning point arrived during a quiet morning over coffee. Richard, now 72 and showing the first subtle signs of frailty, mentioned a letter he had received from an old business associate in Australia. They were looking for experienced project managers for a long-term infrastructure development, a role that perfectly matched Julian's dormant professional skills. Richard sighed, shaking his head. A shame Julian is so settled here. It's a magnificent opportunity, but I suppose he's happy enough helping us with the estate. Clara's heart lunged. In that moment, she saw the door she had been praying for. It wasn't a door to a new life together, but a door to a necessary exile. That night, for the first time, Clara did not meet Julian with a whisper of affection. She met him with the cold, hard clarity of a mother and the weary wisdom of a woman who had seen the bottom of the abyss. They stood in the moonlit garden, the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine surrounding them. "You have to take the job in Australia, Julian," she said, her voice devoid of its usual tremor. Julian recoiled as if struck. "What? Why would you even suggest that? We've survived 2 years, Clara. We've found a way to be together." "We haven't found a way to live," she countered, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "We have found a way to hide. Look at you. You are a man in your prime. Yet you live like a fugitive in your father's house. And look at me. I spend every waking hour waiting for the floor to collapse beneath us. If you stay, we will eventually be caught. And the man who has done nothing but love us both will be destroyed. Is that the legacy you want?" For hours, they argued, a desperate, whispered battle between his desire to stay and her terrifying resolve to let go. Julian pleaded, he cried, he even suggested they run away together. But Clara remained an anchor. She knew that if they fled together, the guilt would follow them across oceans, poisoning whatever new life they tried to build. The only way to kill the sin was to remove the temptation. "I love you enough to let you go," she whispered, her hand resting on his cheek one last time. "And I love myself enough to want to look in the mirror without seeing a criminal. Go, Julian, build a life where you don't have to whisper." The following weeks were a blur of logistics. Clara played the role of the encouraging stepmother to perfection. She helped Julian pack. She researched the city he would be moving to. And she sat with Richard, nodding as he beamed with pride about his son's ambition. It was a masterpiece of deception, the final and most difficult lie she would ever have to tell. The morning of Julian's departure was crisp and clear. The taxi waited in the driveway, its engine idling like a ticking clock. Richard hugged his son tightly, his eyes misty. "Make us proud, son. Don't worry about us. Clara takes good care of things here." Julian turned to Clara. For a fleeting second, the mask slipped. His eyes searched hers, searching for a sign of regret, a plea to stay, a promise of a future. But Clara stood tall, her expression one of polite, maternal warmth. She offered him her hand, not her heart. "Safe travels, Julian," she said firmly. "Write to your father when you can." As the car pulled away, disappearing down the long, tree-lined drive, Clara stood on the porch until the sound of the engine faded into the ambient noise of the morning birds. She felt a strange, hollow sensation in her chest, a vacuum where 2 years of intense, agonizing emotion had once lived. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder. "He'll do well, won't he? He needed this. I'm glad you pushed him to go. Clara, I think he was staying just for our sake." "Yes," Clara replied softly. "He needed to go." The days that followed were remarkably quiet. The house, once a theater of tension, returned to being just a house. Clara returned to her routines, but with a new sense of purpose. She doted on Richard with a genuine tenderness, no longer born of guilt, but of a profound gratitude for his ignorance and his presence. She realized that by sending Julian away, she hadn't just saved Julian, she had saved the dignity of her marriage and the soul of the man she had sworn to honor. 2 years passed. Letters arrived from Australia, photos of Julian on a sun-drenched beach, news of a promotion, and eventually, a picture of a woman named Sarah whom he had started dating. Richard would read these letters aloud at the dinner table, his voice full of joy. Clara would listen, smiling, feeling a profound sense of peace. The silent truth of what had happened between them remained buried. A secret that would eventually be taken to the grave. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sunset, Clara felt a sudden lightness of being. The desire that had once burned so fiercely was now nothing more than a cold ash. Swept away by the winds of time and distance, she had faced the darkest parts of her nature and, through a painful, selfless choice, had emerged back into the light. Richard came out to join her, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "It's getting chilly, Clara, shall we go in?" She looked at him, her husband, her partner, the man who had stayed by her side through a storm he never even knew existed. She took his hand, her grip firm and honest. "Yes, Richard," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Let's go home." As she stepped across the threshold and closed the door, she let out a long, slow breath, the final sigh of a woman who was, at last, truly free.